50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot. Today, another exciting video for you. We're going to learn how to land the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. This is potentially one of the most modern aircraft out on the market at the moment. It's a really impressive machine and it's a big, heavy, long-haul airliner. And today I'm going to take you through the steps of landing it. I am a real-world Boeing 787 pilot, so hopefully I can give you some extra context on your home simulations. But none of this is, of course, for any real-world use. We're going to be landing into London Heathrow. This is the Boeing 787-9, but this tutorial will be applicable to whichever Boeing 787 you use, whether it's the 787-8, 9 or -10, all of which are available as long as you have the Premium Deluxe Edition of Microsoft Flight Simulator. They are all available included in that version, as long as you use the Horizon mod for the 787-9 and the Kuro mod for the 787-8. Like I say, this will be applicable to all three. It's a very standard airliner. The three variants are very similar and they have a lot of computers and a lot of clever things going on that make sure that they all behave in a very, very similar way. But we'll talk about some of the minor differences you might notice. Before watching this video, I highly recommend you watch my preparation for descent, approach and landing tutorial that I have on the channel already. That will take you through how to set the airplane up for the arrival and how to fly the ILS approach, and also a brief overview on landing before we get into a bit more detail for today's tutorial. Although if you haven't seen that, don't worry, I'll go through everything you need to know to land the jet today. Right, let's get started. To start with, let's quickly get the airplane set up. We're arriving into London Heathrow and we're going to fly the ILS to runway 27 left. So I need to go into my CDU or FMC and I'm going to select the ILS runway 27 left. I'm going via Biggin, but this, whichever arrival you're doing. But ILS 27 left, glide slope on. We're flying an ILS today. On the InitRef page, approach, I'm going to select the flap landing, or the landing flap I want to use today, which today will be flap 25, which is the normal landing flap on a good length runway. If you have a shorter runway or some other reason, you may choose to do a flap 30 landing. Don't worry, the technique is identical between the two. So I'm going to select flap 25, VAP 146 in there. Good. We're not going to worry about transition altitudes and things like that because we're already pretty low down. We're at 6,000 feet. We're basically flying outbound and then back in towards Biggin to fly that arrival and join the ILS. We need to set our auto brake, so I'm going to select auto brake 3 for landing today. So flap 25 auto brake 3, and then I'll use idle reverse thrust after landing. And we'll put in the minima. So the minimums today are going to be 280 feet. So I'm just going to put that in here on the baro setting. And as ever, I find this switch incredibly frustrating to use. Again, not really relevant for what we're doing today, but just for completeness. There we go. So that's all looking good. Then you're just going to want to press the cancel recall to make sure no warnings appear. So recall but no ICAS warnings appear or cautions or anything like that. So that's all good, or advisories. And I'm going to get rid of those secondary engine instruments. We wouldn't have those on for the approach. And finally, we are going to go to our checklist tab and check which checklist we're up to. So next will be the descent checklist. So we've done recall, we've set the auto brake, we've done the landing data, VRF 25, 146, minimums 280, and we've done the approach briefing. So that is ready to go. And next will be the actual approach checklist where we're on altimeters, which we've already set to the QNH 1013. So that is done. That's the approach checklist complete. Next will be the landing checklist. So that comes later. Good stuff. Right, speaking of approach briefing, let's just have a quick look at the chart so you know what we're doing. So here it is, ILS 27 left will be following the arrival from Biggin Hill, which is over here, and then it will fly us around onto this approach. India Lima Lima is the ILS, frequency 109.5, course 269. And I can actually go in here on the NavRad page and check that, 109.5, course 269. This will then appear up here and it will ident India Lima Lima. So this is all a good sign that the ILS has worked. Again, this isn't a full ILS tutorial. This is just me just giving you a quick setup in case you haven't seen my video on how to do that, but I do it in a much slower and more detailed fashion in my full descent approach and landing tutorial video. Good, so let's get ourselves now onto the ILS and then we can talk about the landing and we'll go through step by step everything we're going to do. Let's get the HUD out as well because we'll certainly be using that today. Beautiful. So on the map now you can see here's the ILS approach. It goes via CF 27 left, final fix 27 left, and then in. So I'm just going to do a bit of a shortcut and we'll head towards the CF27 left. Now what air traffic will often do is they'll vector you. So if we were to be given a heading of, let's say, 320, and then I go heading select by pressing in here, and then we go heading cell 320, and now we're being vectored. They tell us we're being vectored to the ILS, descend to 3,000 feet. So I'll put 3,000 feet in the window. So I put 3,000 feet in the window, and then I'll fly in vertical speed. So I'll select vertical speed and then wind the wheel down, and we'll do 800 feet per minute. Now I want to sequence my flight plan, so I want to extend this leg out. So to do that, I'm just going to put in, take the point I want to do it from, so CF27L, put it to the top, and then you can see intercept course direct to, and we'll do 270, and then it draws out a nice line, execute, and now that is our active sort of line. In the real airplane it would draw it out. Also there's actually a shortcut in the real airplane. You can just press the departure arrivals page. But anyway, there we go. So we're on a heading, and soon we should start to see our ILS information appear. It's slightly delayed in Microsoft Flight Simulator. It would already be there in the real aircraft, but it wants us to be within a certain distance. So we'll take heading 310 degrees now and just point towards it. Okay, so we're getting closer, and I've paused the sim just for a second to show you a few things. First of all, the ILS indication is starting to appear. Here's our localizer appearing on the PFD, and it also appears on the HUD at the bottom here. This is the way it would work in the real aircraft, although it would happen a bit earlier on. In Microsoft Flight Simulator, it tends to happen after 30 miles. It would probably show up earlier than that in the real aircraft, although you wouldn't want to use it until you're within sort of 20 miles typically. But there we go. So starting to look sensible. I've also selected the speed to the up speed, you can see here. If I want to go any slower than that up speed, and here it is on the PFD, remember the HUD is just an exact replication of the PFD, in this mode certainly. I'll do a tutorial in the future where I show the other mode of the HUD, but yeah, it's in up, and if I want to go any slower I need to put out some flaps. Now, in terms of speeds, it's exactly the same as it was on the Airbus, and this is, I'm talking here about speeds, what speed we want to be on the approach. So 25 miles out, 220 knots is no problem at all. We also need to be 3 times our height away from the runway, if that makes sense. So I'm at 3,600 feet. So I need to times that by 3. So let's round it to 4,000 feet, and then times it by 3, so 12 miles. 4 times 3 is 12. So at 4,000 feet, I need to be 12 miles away from the runway. If I'm any higher than that, or if I'm any closer, then I know I have a bit of an issue. I'm 3,600 feet. So what I need to be is about 10,800 feet, 10.8 miles away from the runway. So about 11 miles out from the runway. Now, if I was, let's say this said 10 miles and I'm at 3,600 feet, I know I'm getting a bit close. If it said 9 miles and I'm at 3,600 feet, then I know I'm 600 feet high. If it said 6 miles and I'm at 3,600 feet, then I'm very high and I'm not going to be able to continue that approach. So it works both ways. So about 3 times your height is the amount of miles you should have to go, and the miles are shown here, your DME, distance measuring equipment. Something to watch for is that some of the DMEs don't match up, but again, on a normal ILS, especially in Europe, they tend to. But anyway, that's talking about distance to touchdown. So you can also check on here, and I can see that here's 20 miles on my range, so the runway is just over 20 miles away, so the 25.5 matches up. So as we get closer, we'll slow down. So let's run that in real time. So let's continue the sim. So we are now moving, and let's imagine we're cleared to join the localizer at 25 miles. That's not too unreasonable, so I can arm lock with the button up here, lock. Now on the Boeing you can only do one localizer, and then you can arm approach once you're established on the localizer. This is because of an old Boeing thing where they would actually intercept the glide slope before the localizer, which you're not allowed to do, so they had to be done separately like this. However, the 787 I believe would not do that, but it's just typical practice to keep it in line with the Boeing 777, which would do it. So there we go. So now we've armed the localizer. As this diamond comes across, which measures the center line from the runway here, then the airplane will automatically intercept it. And here we are leveling at 3,000 feet. We'll be a bit low on this approach. Still safe, but just keeping things simple. This is, again, meant to be a landing tutorial. Something else you'll see is that once the localizer activates, the heading bug will spin round to point down the runway. Quite a handy little feature. Again, I'd prefer not to have a heading bug at all when we don't need it, but there we go. Good. 220 knots now, so what speed should we be? Well, we can do 220 knots until about 12 miles, and then it just counts down. So at 10 miles, you want to be doing no more than 200 knots. At 8 miles, you want to be doing no more than 180 knots. so they just sequence like that. At 6 miles, 160 knots, 5 miles, 150 knots, back to your approach speed. Now the 787 is a quick aeroplane. Look at those beautiful, beautiful swept wings. It does want to fly fast, so actually you can sometimes be a little bit quicker than that and still get away with it, but to keep things simple for yourself, those are the speeds I would recommend sticking to at first. Good stuff. So here we go, lock has activated and the heading bug has spun round, and now we see our glide slope indication. We're on the localizer, so I'm now going to arm the approach, which arms the glide slope, which we get in white on here, and again replicated up here in the HUD, which is just the same. So we'll fly down this ILS, and then I can bring you to the landing. We'll pause and talk through the landing tutorial bit. Now we're getting to 14 miles, still doing 220 knots. Remember, 220 knots is good until 12 miles, so let's start slowing things down. I need to put out flap 1 before I can go below that green up speed, so let's select flap 1. And we can check it. You always check what you've selected by looking here. There's the 1 and it's traveling, and now it's green, so the 1 is out. As soon as you've selected it, you are allowed to slow down. Just make sure you have definitely selected the right one. So there we go, coming back to the 1 speed, which you can see below 200 knots. This is a 787-9, so we have lots and lots of flap settings. The 787-8 has less settings, but it doesn't really matter. Just use what you need to. They all go typically 1, 5, and then you go gear down, flap 20, and then 25 and 30 for landing. The rest of these are just takeoff settings, but they are available if, for example, air traffic control gives you a speed restriction or something like that where you need it. Right, 200 knots, and that's good for until 10 miles. We're at 11.5, so let's slow down the next stage. Let's get ahead of the game here. So we'll go to flap 5. By the way, if you're wondering the speed limit for the flaps, they are down here. It's important that you only select the flap when you're below the limitation here, because this red bar will come down and it will shout at you, and you don't want to overspeed the flaps. But there we go. Now we can come down to the green 5 because we have the 5 out, but we cannot go below that 5. Great stuff. It's all coming together. The glide slope is now about to reach us. You want to have flap 5 out by the time you're going down the glide slope. That's because flap 1 is basically just slats along the front and it doesn't give you enough drag, so the airplane will actually accelerate down the glide slope. Flap 5 puts the trailing edge flaps out a bit, and that gives you enough drag that the airplane is a bit more under control going downhill as it is now. Now we're on the glide slope and glide slope mode is activated. I can put the go around altitude into the window of the MZP, 2,000 feet there. Great. You can see the speed is still accelerating slightly, and we're doing 187 at 8 miles, so we've managed to get fast a little bit. So let's get out some more flap. I'm going to go to flap 15. There's 15, and I'm going to widen the speed back. But as I said, gets away from you quickly, this airplane. It's very fast, so don't be afraid to use the speed brake if you need it. So I'm going to put the speed brakes out. They're very effective. That'll slow it down. Now, around about 2,000 feet from above the runway, so about 6 miles from touchdown, we'll lower the gear. If the airplane is running away from you and you've got too fast, let's say you're doing 190 knots still, then it will be perfectly reasonable to just drop the gear, which is what I'm going to do now. So the next step would be gear down, flap 20. So we'll go gear down. And that's a huge amount of drag. And we'll go to flap 20. I can wind the speed back to 20 and put away the speed brakes. That's what that warning's for. Good. Right, let's put out our landing flap then to stabilize for the approach. So that's flap 25. And then we wind the speed bug back to sit on top of the VREF. So VREF plus 5. So we can see in here, we can see our VREF of 146. So 151 will be our approach speed. But like I say, just sit the bottom of that triangle, the magenta bug on the ref, and it works on the HUD as well. Now we need to arm the speed brakes for touchdown. We do have to arm them for landing. We don't for takeoff, and it will say speed brake armed here on the ICAS. And then we can run the landing checklists. Speed brake armed, landing gear down, flaps are at 25. The real aircraft would check you have the right flap setting there. Now we're all set up to land. Isn't that simple enough? So let me pause the sim here and start talking about what we can see. This is what we call a stabilized approach. We want everything stable by 1,000 feet above the runway. To see how high you are above the runway, you have the radio altimeter showing here. So this is 1180. We are 1180 feet above the ground, even though we're 1,220 feet above sea level. That's because the ground is slightly higher than sea level. So 1,000 feet above the runway, we want to be stable, which we are. What does stable mean? Well, we are fully configured. So the gear is out, the flaps are at the right setting, the speed brakes are armed. So that is our setup for landing. we also want to make sure we're at the right airspeed. So we're at our 150 knots, which is 5 knots above VREF. That's where we plan to be for the landing. So that's good. And we want to make sure we are on the right localizer and glide slope, which we are. We can see the diamonds are in the middle. They're all in a good place. Again, full ILS tutorial another time. But there we go. Now, don't worry about these other modes. Rolled out and flare have armed, and land 3 green is showing. These are to do with auto land. We're not using that today, but they're a good sign the airplane is pretty happy with the approach. You can also see it's starting to draw a rising runway below it. Right, what are we going to do next? Well, let's have a look through the HUD and get a full HUD tutorial coming later, but this heads-up display has some nice perks. I can actually see this 3-degree line through it. This line is a visual representation of what 3 degrees from where we are now leads us to. So this is a 3-degree approach. This ILS is 3 degrees. That's the standard approach. If it was a different angle, this would show up at the correct angle in the HUD, but there we go. So 3 degrees is what 99% of ILSs are. That line should run through the runway, and it does. You can see here it's running right through the touchdown zone of the runway, which is perfect because we want to land in the touchdown zone. So I want to be aiming to the aiming point, which will be somewhere near the PAPIs, those position approach path indicator lights, those red and white lights here. That's where we need to aim the aeroplane, or even better, you're basically aiming for just after the threshold. That's what you should really be looking at. So this line should run through it. If this dashed line was halfway down the runway or further, that would mean we're coming in too shallow. We're not actually going to make it to where we want to. And if it's coming in below the runway, then we're too low and we're coming in too steep. So if this dashed line was below the runway, then we are low, and our 3 degrees is going to take us to a point before the runway. If it's showing past the runway or halfway down, then we're too high, and we're not actually, by flying a 3-degree approach, going to make it to the runway threshold where we want to be. This is the flight path vector, this thing with wings on, and it's sitting lined up on the threshold as well. So this is showing us where we're going. So this is pointing at the threshold, and it's lined up with the 3-degree line. That means we are on a 3-degree approach, which we can also see because of the glide slope indicator over here lined up, knowing therefore that we're at 3 degrees. Now, what can happen, and I'll show this in the HUD tutorial, but if these aren't in line, then you could still aim at the runway, but you could be flying a much steeper approach than 3 degrees, or you could be aiming. If this flight path vector, for example, was pointing down here, it means we're sinking. So even if the 3-degree line was on the threshold, if the flight path vector is low, then we're sinking faster than we need to maintain 3 degrees. So that 3 degrees will start getting dragged below all of this sort of stuff. I don't want you to get too bogged down with it. It's just a quick run through of what it is. More importantly, at the moment as well, we have the aircraft attitude symbol, which is this set of wings here. This is showing us the pitch of the airplane, and this matches the little dot on the PFD. So you can see it's about 0 on the PFD, and it's about level on the horizon here. It is much more sensitive through the HUD. Things look like they're moving a lot, when actually, if you looked at the PFD, they're barely moving at all. So keep that in mind. On final approach in the real aircraft, I expect it to be about 1 degree above the horizon. I have noticed in the simulator it tends to sit slightly low, but we shall see how that plays out in a minute. But yeah, so 0 to 1 degree is normal. In the real airplane, I would say 1 to 2 degrees would be normal, but there we go. So that's all good. That's a pretty set up approach. What we're going to do now is I'm going to release the sim and we'll just fly down like that, and we'll prepare for the landing. What's going to happen is, as we get closer to the threshold will eventually disappear beneath the airplane, and that's fine. We're going to move our visual aiming point from the threshold, which is where we're looking now, because we're looking outside, right? We've got the HUD, we've got the visual picture, but we're going to move looking for the threshold down to the end of the runway, which will mean we have something to look at as we go into the flare, and it will help us judge the landing. So let's carry on. I'm going to release the sim, and here we go, stabilized. And it will do its own corrections. The autopilot's doing its corrections. The real airplane has a thing called a landing attitude modifier. What it would do is it will actually put up bits of the wing and spoilers and ailerons and so on in different ways to make sure that the airplane maintains the same attitude regardless of what airspeed and flap setting you're using. By the way, if you do a flap 30 landing, it is the same technique as we're talking about here. You'll have the same pitch. The airplane modifies the wing to make sure that it's the same pitch, and the picture looks the same for the pilots. Here you can see that it is just too low. The nose shouldn't be down here really. I'm not entirely sure why this is happening. If anything, I would be tempted to lower the speed. But I would say in the sim, just stick with it. Stick with the speeds we've talked about. It's just a bit of a thing with it at the moment. This is starting to look a bit more natural. So you can see here the flight path vector sitting in the touchdown zone, the 3-degree line crossing the PAPIs or crossing the center of that touchdown zone. Perfect. This is where we want to be. Let's just pause it here. So we're now at 340 feet above the runway, and you can see even more clearly where we're aiming. This triangle here is the accelerometer, so it is moving up and down according to whether we're accelerating or decelerating. So at the moment it's above the wing, suggesting we are increasing in speed. If it goes below the wing, it would suggest we're decreasing in speed. This little box here is this tape, which moves below the wing if we're below our target speed. So you can see it's slightly below the wing because we are slightly below our target speed. It would go above the wing if we are slightly above our target speed. Again, not super relevant for today. And you can see, you can't see that on the PFD. That's one feature where the HUD has some advantages. So let's talk about the landing. So as we get closer, I'm going to move my aiming point. So we're going to cross the threshold, and instead of looking here, I'm going to move my eyes down here to the end of the runway. That's what we need to do. We're going to hold the pitch attitude where it is, so 0 to 1 degree in the sim seems to work nicely. And then what we're going to do is it's going to count down 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. Those countdowns are the rad out from the touchdown of the wheels. So at 50, it means these wheel line here is 50 feet from the runway surface. It's very accurate because it's using a radio signal bounced from the bottom of the airplane and back up again. And it's much more accurate than the normal altimeter. And that is, again, from these wheels dangling here. The radio altimeter, once you touch down and once you land, actually goes to minus numbers because your gear compresses. But anyway, I digress. 50, 40, 30. At 30 feet is when we begin the flare. The flare is the maneuver to raise the nose of the airplane to soften that touchdown. So what we're going to do is we're going to simply raise the nose a couple of degrees just after it says 30. You don't want to do it earlier than 30. It's strange, but this is a very fast aeroplane on approach. We're coming in at 150 knots, and that's pretty good considering we're not even at max landing weight, although we're not far off it. But because we're so fast, we have really good control of the flight controls. I love landing the Boeing 787. It has a lot of energy. And what I mean by that is if you flare, you've got these nice big elevators, and you've got a lot of air going over them, and the airplane's got a nice low nose, so all that air is just all channeled beautifully, and the airplane responds immediately to the flare. It's great. Some airplanes can have a bit low energy in the flare. So you actually end up starting that flare maneuver slightly later than the A320. Even though we're coming in faster and in a heavier airplane, we can actually flare slightly later because it responds so much quicker. So at 30 you start the flare. In the Airbus you basically needed to have the nose moving by 30 feet, whereas in this at 30 feet you start the maneuver. If you do it any earlier, you'll just end up floating down the whole runway, because the downside of coming in so fast is that we actually run out of touchdown zone. Because remember, we want to touch down. You see these white markers? We want to touch down before they run out. So landing here is no good. We need to land here or before in these white markers. Ideally on these big white ones. They are the aiming point. So yeah, we're going to flare just after 30. We are in auto throttle speed mode, which is correct. So we don't need to touch the throttles. What's going to happen is at 25 feet rad out, the auto throttle system will close the thrust levers to idle, and that's a great feature of the big Boeings. So don't need to worry about thrust levers at all. We don't even just decide, we just flare. And again, you might think, well, isn't it nicer to choose when to close the thrust levers like we could on the Airbus? Well, you don't need to, because the airplane has the energy in it. So even if you get a bit of sink, you can just flare a bit more promptly, and it will respond, which is just great. I love it. So yeah, that's it. We could talk about crosswind a little bit, but basically all you want to do is, once you've done the flare, just like the Airbus, apply rudder in the direction to line up the nose of the airplane with the runway. Now this is the nose of the airplane here. I will show a crosswind landing after this just to give you an idea of what that means. So we'll talk about that later. So this is just the landing technique. So to recap, I know I've talked a lot here. What we're going to do is we're going to cross the threshold, look towards the end of the runway. We're going to then at 30 start our flare, just raising the nose a little bit, a couple of degrees. You'll see the amount I do. And thrust levers will idle, and then we're into the flare, and you'll see this flight path vector move down the runway. Don't worry about it. It's not responsive enough to use for landings in real life. It has a bit of lag in it, so it can be misleading. Then the wheels will touch down, the speed brakes will deploy, and then you have to be really careful, because unlike the Airbus, the nose on the 787 wants to come crunching in. It will just drop on you. The auto brake deploys quickly and the nose just comes straight down. So you need to actually land and immediately hold the back pressure on the yoke, or maybe even add some more to stop the nose from just crunching in. And then you'll find that you're actually holding the nose off the ground, and you'll be pulling back more and more to stop it crunching in. But you don't want to raise the nose again, you don't want to tail strike. but it's just a balancing act of just making sure it doesn't come down too fast. So enough talking. Let's go have a look at this first landing, and we'll see if we can get a couple more in. So let's release the sim. Disconnect the autopilot. You can see it goes to flight director mode. So now we are flying. The airplane should still be in trim, so don't touch the trim. The autopilot would have done that. Still aiming that flight path vector down towards those white markers you can see here. And now we're getting to threshold, looking towards the end of the runway now. 30, flare, hold it there. It's idle on its own. Bit of a float, but there's touchdown. Hold the nose, hold the nose. I'm pulling back on the yoke still, pulling back. And now the nose is down. The speed brakes are up. No, that's my fault for not closing my hardware thrust levers. And we get onto the reverse eventually. There we go. Now you can see the auto brake kick in, we're reducing speed. But there we go. That is it. Getting onto the manual brakes now. By using the toe brakes, it disconnects the auto brake, so it goes to the off position. And now we can just bring the airplane to a stop on the runway. Here's our decelerometer, by the way. See this triangle that I was talking about earlier? So as I squeeze on, it goes down below the wing because we're decelerating. And if I was to add power, you can see it go above the wing as we accelerate.
Fifty, 40, 30, 20, 10. Fifty, 40, 30, 20, 10. 40, 20, 10.
As promised then, here we are on approach, but this time with a bit of a crosswind. As you can see, we are pointing to the left. We have a 180.19, so the runway is heading 270, so this is a 90-degree crosswind from the left, about 20 knots here, a little bit lower on the ground. As you can see, a slightly different picture. The HUD is, again, it's our primary landing tool on the 787. It's what most pilots will be using, although you can just land from the PFD, of course. But from the PFD, we don't really see much different. This looks exactly the same as it did on our last approach. The only little clues are that the heading down here is clearly not pointing straight down the runway like it was earlier. The bigger clue would be on the navigation display, where you can see our heading is at we're pointing heading 262, but the runway is obviously 260, or just under. So the flight path vector is still in the same place. As I move around the flight deck, notice that it is glued in time and space to the right thing outside. That's the clever part of the heads-up display. The 3-degree line's in the same place, and there's still a circle in the middle. We didn't talk about it earlier, but this is the flight director, and that's also pointing us in, shows that we are flying where it wants us to go. The flight path vector, the bird as it was called on the Airbus, should be around that. So yeah, all looking good. The difference is it's not lined up with our aircraft pointer. Remember, this represents that little dot on the HUD, on the PFD. And this is pointing off to the left because the airplane is not pointing down the runway, it's pointing into the wind slightly, as it needs to in order for us to fly. If I take out the autopilot now and point this aircraft symbol over the runway like it looked earlier, then this flight path vector will move to the right because the wind will now blow us right towards those terminals. That is not something we want to happen. In fact, let me show you what would happen if we did that. So I've just released the sim, disconnect the autopilot. Oh, bit of a twitch there. And I'll move it to the right. and you'll see that as I move that aircraft symbol, the flight path vector disappears to the right, and now we're drifting off that centre line and it's all going wrong. So let's move ourselves back over. You would not continue this approach to landing, by the way. That would just be an unstable approach, and you would go around from this point. So we'll move ourselves back over and put ourselves back where we should be, roughly back on the flight director. Okay, so now for the landing, pretty much the same, but the difference is, let me just pause it here. Right, yeah, so that whole approach you'd have been, because of course we've become so unstable, you don't want to be fiddling around like that on final. But here we are, back coming towards the threshold, same actions. I'm going to look towards the end of the runway, but now all I need to do is after I flare, so just after 30 feet, I'm going to start the flare, and I'm going to move the aircraft symbol down the runway, so we're pointing down the runway for touchdown. This is called decrabbing, so we're removing that crab angle, that sideways slip. So enter the flare just as we did before, but this time use rudder to move this airplane symbol to point down the runway. When we do that, I'm going to need to use right rudder today, you can see, because if I don't, the airplane will point down. Sorry, right rudder is what I need, because I'm pointing to the left, so I need to use right rudder to bring the nose round down the runway. As I do that, this wing, this upwind wing, will actually go faster through the air, and it will try and lift, because more air will rush over it and less air will go over this one, because this wing will decelerate slightly, this wing will accelerate. It's a secondary effect of yawing. So what you need to do is actually introduce a little bit of aileron towards the side of the wind. So I'm going to use right rudder, the opposite of the wind, but I'm going to need to use left aileron. Wind's coming from the left, so I need to use left aileron in the flare in order to make sure that everything stays nice and level. We need to keep those wings level. When we touch down, same as before, speed brakes will come up, we go on the reversers and we hold that nose wheel from slamming in. But as we are rolling down the runway, I'm going to maintain that interwind aileron, that left aileron, and I'll show you what I mean. So, okay, so coming in on final, manual thrust this time, and you can see that the airplane symbol's off to the left, coming a bit high with the threshold. Into the flare, right rudder, and then a bit of left aileron, down to idle, and there's touchdown, speed brakes up, and then we get the reversers out, hold off the nose, and now holding that interwind aileron. Now you don't need too much, and you can see here in the sim it actually doesn't really need it at all. In the real aircraft you can end up using quite a lot really, or it can otherwise find itself lifting, because what you don't want the wing to do is if it lifts up, you can destabilize yourself pretty quickly. But there you go. So that's all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. We're going to look at more things with the 787, including the details of what the head-up display is actually giving us and how we can use it. And then we'll get into some non-persistent approaches and all the differences that includes, which is yeah, quite a lot. It's quite an amazing machine, very, very capable aeroplane. So I'm excited to bring that to you. There'll be more tutorials, guides and live streams on the channel, so do please subscribe if you'd like to see more. That's all then. Keep safe and well. We'll see you again in another video or live stream soon. Bye-bye.